Let me just start with this. You don't buy cybersecurity necessarily. You buy cybersecurity for a system. What we call in this environment is a system under consideration. What I'll do is I'll basically share with you the experience we had with UITP. It's the, let's say, the government body for mass transit, so bus and metro operators. But I think that what you will learn can be extended to any other verticals, especially if they're not well adapted to the Purdue Model. You probably know that, so anyway, I'll discuss that. So it's a report, it's 120 pages, and these are the extracts from this. So the first thing is, what was the issues? Maybe you're aware that more and more there is an integration of the digitalization in many critical infrastructures. More and more that there's a usage of what we call COTS product. So COTS product is basically, you know, out-of-the-shelf products. It includes hardware, firmware, and as you know, or you might not know, cybersecurity is a cross-functional process. And procurement is also. So that's the issue. You have two cross-functional that needs to be coordinated. And very often in critical infrastructure, there's no real OT responsibility. You know, Mr. OT doesn't exist. You have a Mr. IT, but you don't have a Mr. OT, which triggers misalignment. So basically you have somebody who doesn't know what he wants to buy, and you have somebody who will answer to that, not knowing what he's selling. So that ends up generally in fights, legal fights, because whatever they propose doesn't fit. And that's the big problem. So we recognize that, and at the Metro organization, we basically decided to create a document that will help you specify very easily some cybersecurity contractual requirements. So the objectives was to provide guidelines. If you want afterwards, I'll be happy to forward you that document. It's how do you, as a procurement person, buy cybersecurity things. You're all cybersecurity expert here, but you don't buy. There's somebody who will in your company do that process for you, and that guys have no clue about what to do. And I'm not even sure that you do if you're in the IT world, because in the OT world, it's very different. This is what Daniel said this morning, and the reality is exactly true. So we kind of said, what are the minimum requirements that we want to do? And here you see it. We say basically that you need to take into account at least 4 different level of networks. One is the safety critical network. This is unique to railways and to these kinds of industry. This is a bit different than the ICS that you're familiar with. You have the OCN, Operational Control Networks. You have the ACN, the Administrative Control Networks, and all the other party networks that we kind of characterize. The other principle is defense in depth. I'll go over this, but basically this is what you need to do. At least for any industry you're in, think about defense in depth. And I'll come back to that afterwards. And the other point is we focus on OT in this document. We didn't look into IT because there's a lot of things that exist in IT. The point is, and it goes back to the problem, you know, things are OT and IT. It's not that black and white. In some industries, there are some systems that are not surely IT, OT, and what do you do? So you need to take that decision. Are they in the IT or in the OT world? You know, a ticketing system, if it stops, the entire system will stop. So is it IT, is it OT? It's not that obvious, okay? So anyway, these are the 10 general requirements. You know, you can apply it to your business. I think it'll make a lot of sense. The point is your RFP, so I don't know if you're familiar with RFP. RFP is basically the request for a proposal. They need to take into account your country laws, okay? Seems obvious, but it needs to take that into account. It also needs to take the relevant standards. I'll talk about IEC 62443, that was mentioned this morning, but it's not the only one. Some industries are now starting to have their own cybersecurity requirements. In the case of rail, it's TS 5701, and basically there will be a new one that will probably be edited next year. You need to take into consideration in your requirements that it needs to be performed by a qualified person. The operation should always drive the requirement. We call it ISS, Information Security Systems document. You should, and that's one of the requirements, you should create for your industry, for your company, one document where you put systematically all your requirements as an IT person or IoT, and then you pass that information to your procurement person. Other important things, if you're going to buy a system under consideration, you're going to spend maybe $300 million to buy a signaling system, or you're in the airport environment and you're going to buy a baggage handling and you're going to pay $50 million for that, or euros. You need to be sure that he understands where he's going to be implementing his system. How you do that? You need to do a risk and vulnerability assessment. Preliminary, I'll go through that process, that you put into your ISS. It means that the vendor needs to understand what are going to be the vulnerabilities and the risks that he's going to be facing when he's going to sell that system, okay? I mentioned that there are some elements like encryption. You should still, even if it's an OT, address the GDPR issues, because there might be, depending on, like I said, the blur systems, IT/OT, ticketing, passage billings and things like that. And the other point is that whenever you do sell a system, you need to provide to the vendors at least an understanding of what are these policies and procedures that he needs to follow, okay? So this is how you should do it. So the first element, and I think it's interesting, it shows the environment in which a metro operates. So at the top, you see that there's a separation in figure 2. You have the IT environment with all these standards at the right here, ISO 27001, which is more for GDPR. But underneath it, it's all the OT. So within the environment, you have 62443 that we mentioned. And because the railway industry is starting to be quite mature, it has created its own standard. It's a European standard, TS 5701, but it's going to be an international standard as of next year. And that is for OT. So you take the NIST directive, the ENISA recommendations, and you create all that. And you need to apply your requirements to the entire life cycle of your product. You're buying a signaling system, it's 20 years. You buy a train, you buy a bus, it's 15 years, a train is 35 years. It's this entire process. And if you look at the standard in rails, it actually is split. You see the risk assessment that you need to do. This is how you do it. In the middle, you have at the top, you have operation and maintenance. And at the bottom, you have the design. The design, in this case, is still referred to 62443. And all the rest is basically integrated within the standard. Okay? So here there's two processes. If you're a government body, I don't know where you're working. Let's say you're working for PKP. You probably would consider the first process, which is TED. TED is for European. It's online, so that's your process. And if you're basically working, you can provide, I can provide that if you want afterwards, the information. But the point is, if you're, let's say, a private company, you're an oil and gas company, this is the kind of process you're going to do. So all these things, so you start from the needs identification, and then you go to repeat the process. All this. The point is, you need, as a cybersecurity expert, to be involved from the start. Why? Because if you don't put your requirements and you don't put the budget, then they won't be integrated. So you need to be involved from the start at the top. So, you know, market study, assignment of the responsible, CPV correspondence, and all these things. That's where you need to be involved. The problem, obviously, is that there might be some different competencies throughout the process. You know, some people might lead first, it might be the OT person, then it might be the procurement person, sometimes it might be legal, but the point is you need to be involved in all this process for it to work, especially if it's a big process, okay? So that's the point. So I mentioned the information security system, okay? It's a document. We strongly recommend to have one unique document. If you're a big company, that's how you should do it. It should have the main principles, the main requirements. It's basically, as I mentioned, integrates the risk and threat and vulnerabilities, okay? You need to do that. That's important because if not, you don't know if as a vendor, what you need to consider. You need to integrate at least some kind of policies and procedures. What are you doing? Where the system will be implemented? How is it going to be patched? And all these kinds of information. You need, in the OT environment also, to think about test bed. What is a test bed? It's basically people talk about digital twins. It's more or less that. So it's basically you're creating a signaling system or you're creating a passenger information system. You need to install it somewhere. Whenever you're going to patch it, you're going to test it before you patch it, okay? Before you implement it. So that's what you need. So very often in your requirements, you'll say, the vendor will supply a test bed and will at the end give it to me. And I will use it. That's how it should be done. You're not going to patch, so you need to have that environment where you can do that safely, okay? The other point is you might establish a business continuity plan. What happens if your system is hacked? What do I do? It's a passenger information system. Do I stop everything? Or I just put people on the platform and say, okay, the system doesn't work, let's go with it. That's the kind of thing. You also, in the OT environment, need to think about your backup. It's not that simple, okay? Usually what you'll do is you will replicate the same system elsewhere. So if something goes in the system, you will basically have a fail-safe fallback, okay? That needs to be integrated. So these are all elements that you can apply in aviation, you can apply it in auto routes, you could apply it even in a gas and oil plant or whatever. You also need to identify how you're going to deal with cybersecurity support. You're buying a system, okay? You're buying it from, let's say, in rails, from Alstom or Siemens or whatever. Are they going to support the cybersecurity system or not? How long will they prevail? What's the obsolescence of all these systems? You need to think about these things, okay? So you're buying a SIC, so you're buying a big system, but with it, you need all the protections from a cybersecurity perspective. These are also accounting interoperability, auditing and logging, security clearance. In some cases, if you're buying a signaling system, in some countries, the people that will be allowed to work on the cybersecurity need to be cleared, okay? So in critical infrastructure, you're working in an airport, not everybody can work. You need to be checked by the government authority. Other point is training. What kind of training in cybersecurity will you provide? Maybe none if it's a very simple, but normally what needs to be done? And then also in the ISS, you need to say what are the standards that will need to be enforced. Per default should be IEC 62443, but in some industries you have more specific like TS 5701 in the case of public transport. The three last elements that are important to consider is the administration, asset inventory. We did mention that in the morning. It's very important to do because if you don't know what you have, you cannot really protect it. Then the configuration management. And I insist on the defense in depth. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept. I call it the onion. You have different peels. If one peel gets out, you still have a second peel there. So that's the principle of it that needs to be applied. And what is interesting to understand is that there's also physical in this element, so at the boundaries between the perimeter and the physical, and then you have your policies and procedures that are there. I don't expect you to know by heart this graph. I just wanted to say that the difficulty with 62443 is that how do you go from having 17 principle, here I show 10, These are the principle, one of them being defense in depth. And you have 7 foundational requirements. That's IEC 62443. And then for each of them, you have security requirements. So I don't know how many there are, probably 60. That's the biggest problem, okay? It's theoretical. What we've done through this report is basically say, for this is the technology you should consider. So this is what it is. So you saw the graph in the other page. This is how it translates into terms of technologies, okay? So if you're considering foundational requirement 1, which is identification and authentication of control, then you need to consider what you're doing in terms of network access control, what you're doing in terms of multi-factor authentication. You know, if you're buying a signaling system, how will people get logged into it and things like that? That needs to be into it. Then the FR2, which is basically use control. So it's about how you get into a LAN and WAN and all these things. FR3, so is system integrity. So this is where we talk about malicious malware, sandboxing, vulnerability scanners, anti-malware software. I won't go through all of this, but these are basically the technologies in an OT environment that you need to think about, okay? Data confidentiality, you know, we in this document, we prescribe what kind of hashing technologies you should consider based on its recently. I have 8 minutes. So for restricted data flow, you need to think there are as many technologies. So you can have a DMZ, you can have firewalls, you can have data diode, unidirectional gateway. You need to think, is it going to be physical or logical separation? Here's an example because I'm consulting for Waterfall, so I need to put it here. But basically, the idea is exactly this. From this, you need to go to the technology and to the vendor, where you basically need to say, do I need it or I don't need it? And then these are the technologies also. Daniel mentioned that this morning with the SIEM, the SOC, the SOAR, and all these things. What is interesting is here you have the technology that is put within the context of 62443, or in our case 5701 for things. So I have 7 minutes, and I'm going to show you how you do all this. You've seen all the theory now, how you do that in your own environment. So I did it for Metro. So this is how it says. So if you're buying a SUC, so which is yeah, sorry. In this case, it's for UITP, so it's general, it's a recommendation, but it was based on Stockholm, actually. The example was from Stockholm Metro, okay? So how do you do that? So basically, there's different steps. I don't know if you're familiar with this process, but this is how you should do your ISS, or how you should tender your documents. So you go from basically, I can see it's too small here, so I need to go there. So you go from your system definition, what is the signaling, what you're going to do with it. From there, you basically do your risk and vulnerability assessment. I'll show you how we've done it very quickly. Then you need to integrate what's the threat landscape for that specific metro or that specific technology. How do you create the risk analysis between impact, threat, and all these things? This is how you do it. And then once you've done that, you need to apply your standards, policies, and in the end, all this to do the partitioning, okay? So you do all this process to create zones. This is how you protect, in the OT environment, okay? So one thing I suggest in this case, is to create what we call a high-level network architecture. Here you have different environments, so the operational control centers, the stations, the trackside, and you have all the different systems. I don't want you to learn them by heart, but that's the idea. So if you're in industry, you create your own systems and you integrate it wherever that you want it to be, okay? So it could be in the operation control center, it could be on the floor, it could be wherever, but that's how you do that. Once you've done that, you can create that kind of figure. This is basically, as you see, the Purdue model on the left, and how it is integrated within an overall metro environment, okay? I don't ask you to know it by heart. And then you can go into even more details. This is basically a metro. So you have the security, the signaling control network at the bottom. You've got the trains and the communication flow between the different elements. So that's how you do it. So you can segment, and I mentioned initially that you need at least to get some of you. So if you have a safety critical network, in the case of rail, it's signaling. If you're in the airport, it probably is avionics. Then you have your operational control networks, which is based on your SCADA. It's based on your ventilation system, your passenger information system. It can be whatever the systems you have. And then you have what we call the administrative control network. It's all your ERP system. It's everything that is IT driven. And then you have the separation to the internet. So you've done that. Basically, you need to do the risk and vulnerability assessment. This is an example. You do it with A, Bs, and things like that. That's what you need to provide to the vendor, okay? You see we've taken very different criteria, asset availability, asset integrity, and asset confidentiality, but we've kind of rated how they are related one to the other. We've taken the qualitative impact assessment, A, B, C, D, what they are explained, and we've taken the INESA Top 2022. This is how you do it. You know, if you're in the OT environment, you need to provide that to your procurement person. And then once you've done all that, the result is this. It's a network segmentation. Here you've got an example of where it's done directly by a continuous monitoring system. On the right, you have the communications flow that are allowed, prohibited, or conditional to using some different technologies. And all this gives you security zones and conduits. This is the process. Once you've done that, you give that to your vendor and say, please apply it. Okay? So I still have 3 minutes. I think this, maybe just a last recommendation. You do need to create a physical gap between the IT and OT environment. We mentioned that. Can be done through data diet, like Daniel was saying this morning. But in the end, you need to do a complete network segmentation. I work in metros, but I also work in aviation. I can tell you, aviation is about 5 to 10 years behind railways. Why? Because they have a flat network. It means that you enter from, I'm exaggerating, from the baggage handling, and you can go up to the avionics if you want to, okay? So very easy to hack, and actually with repercussion that could be fantastic for a hacker, okay? So I'm saying you need to think for whatever industry you're working that you need to segment your market. First thing, separation between the IT and OT, but even in your OT environment, you need to do segmentation, okay? And that's it, and I'm 1 minute 53 before my end of my presentation.